The verdict is immediate. Marcus Aurelius did not possess superior psychology through fate. He engineered a biohack, a deliberate, repeatable protocol that rewired his neural architecture under conditions designed to produce systemic collapse. Let that land. We are not talking about wisdom. We are talking about circuitry. We are talking about a man who ruled 70 million people across a fractured empire, commanded 17 legions along the Danube frontier, watched half his children die, endured a co-emperor's betrayal, and still produced some of the most cognitively disciplined writing in recorded human history. Meditations was not philosophy. It was a maintenance log, a diagnostic report filed nightly by a man auditing his own neural processing under maximum load. Every entry is a recalibration. Every paragraph is a man catching cognitive drift before it cascades into systemic failure. Scanning the synaptic density of Marcus Aurelius, the data returns an immediate anomaly. The signal-to-noise ratio in this specific historical moment was astronomical. 165 AD, the Antonine Plague enters Rome. 15% of the empire's population will die. Supply chains fracture. Military morale collapses. And Marcus Aurelius does not spiral. He does not perform public grief for political capital. He writes, "Confine yourself to the present." That is not a platitude, that is a prefrontal override command, a hard-coded instruction to the default mode network, terminating retrospective rumination before the cascade completes. This is the anomaly historians never autopsied. Not what he did, but how the circuitry allowed him to do it when every environmental variable was engineered for collapse. The architecture that survived that stress test is the subject of this forensic analysis. Historians call it leadership. Biographers call it virtue. Philosophers call it Stoic discipline. All of them are wrong, not partially, entirely. These are comfort words, conceptual anesthesia applied to a phenomenon that deserved a microscopic forensic lens. Every time a historian writes, Marcus possessed remarkable self-control, they have committed intellectual malpractice. They have described the output while refusing to examine the mechanism. Dismiss the narrative. Engage the biology. The traditional model treats historical greatness as a character trait, something inherent, mystical, inherited through bloodline or bestowed by circumstance. This model is not just lazy. It is operationally useless. It provides zero transfer value. You cannot replicate a virtue. You cannot train a destiny. But you can replicate a protocol. You can map a neural architecture. You can identify the specific synaptic pathways that generated a specific behavioral output. And once you have that map, once you possess the actual source code, the performance becomes reproducible. This is what the standard historical model categorically failed to do. The microscopic forensic lens operates differently. It does not ask what Marcus Aurelius decided. It asks which circuit processed the decision. It does not ask why he was calm. It asks which neurotransmitter cascade was being actively suppressed and through what mechanism. This distinction is not academic. It is the difference between admiring a system and operating one. The forensic record is specific. Marcus Aurelius was not born into simplicity. He was identified at age 7 by Emperor Hadrian, a man famous for his own obsessive discipline, and immediately inserted into an accelerated cognitive training environment. Rhetoric, philosophy, physical endurance protocols. Each one, in modern neuroscientific terms, represents targeted prefrontal priming. The historians saw tutors. The forensic lens sees a training regimen for executive function circuitry. The training did not build his character. It built his hardware. And the hardware had a specific address in the neural architecture, one that history never thought to identify. Isolate the circuitry. Two primary regions, two functional systems that, operating in synchronized high fidelity, produced every behavioral output we now misclassify as Stoic virtue. Region 1, the Anterior Cingulate Cortex, the ACC. This is the brain's conflict detection system. Its primary function is error monitoring, identifying the gap between the current state and the desired state, then allocating attentional resources to close that gap. In a low-functioning ACC, emotional reactivity floods executive processing. The signal becomes noise. The system chases immediate threat data at the cost of long-range strategic modeling. In Marcus Aurelius, the ACC was operating at elite calibration. Every entry in Meditations demonstrates this. When he writes about anger, specifically when he writes about the impulse to retaliate against courtiers who lied to him, generals who failed him, the Senate that performed empty flattery, he does not suppress the emotion. He intercepts it. He catches the error signal early in its cascade and reroutes the processing load before it reaches behavioral output. This wasn't a choice. It was a calibrated response. Region 2, the Dorsolateral Prefrontal Cortex, the DLPFC. If the ACC is the conflict detector, the DLPFC is the strategic processor, working memory, temporal sequencing, the capacity to hold multiple competing variables in active processing simultaneously without losing resolution on any single thread. Governing the Roman Empire required processing thousands of concurrent variables: military logistics, senatorial politics, provincial taxation, frontier diplomacy, plague management, succession planning, with zero degradation in decision quality. This ancient biohack allowed for a level of psychology that defies the baseline. The signal-to-noise ratio in this specific operational context was unlike anything in recorded governance history. Marcus Aurelius was receiving corrupted intelligence from every direction: political theater, military distortion, philosophical flattery, and he was filtering all of it in real time. The mechanism, Meditations itself, the nightly writing practice was not journaling. It was a deliberate DLPFC activation protocol, forcing linguistic encoding of abstract emotional states, which neurologically requires the prefrontal cortex to override limbic reactivity. Every time Marcus wrote, "This thing that disturbs me is not the event, but my judgment of it," he was performing a live synaptic recalibration. The tool was ancient, the mechanism was surgical, and the results built the most documented high-performance neural architecture in the classical world. Here is where the standard model fractures completely. Marcus Aurelius lost his biological father at age 3. Let that metabolic load register. 3 years old, the foundational attachment circuitry, the system that calibrates threat detection and reward processing for the entirety of a human life, was subjected to catastrophic early disruption. Traditional biography calls this tragedy. The forensic lens identifies it differently: neural hardening, prefrontal priming under adverse load conditions. Early loss, processed without complete psychological collapse, produces specific epigenetic signatures. The stress response circuitry is calibrated at a higher threshold. The system learns, not cognitively but architecturally, that environmental conditions can be maximally hostile and the organism can still sustain operational function. This is not suffering reframed as virtue. This is adversity operating as a biological tuning instrument. His mother, Domitia Lucilla, compensated with extraordinary intellectual investment. Rather than shielding young Marcus from complexity, she accelerated his exposure to it. Philosophy at 7. Rhetoric before 10. Physical training synchronized with cognitive load. A protocol that modern performance neuroscience would recognize as deliberate stress inoculation. The system was being hardened in real time. But here is the data point that stops the standard model entirely. At age 17, Marcus was adopted by Emperor Antoninus Pius, inserted directly into the highest power environment on the planet, and he responded, not with corruption, not with narcissistic expansion, but with increased cognitive restraint. He voluntarily continued wearing his simple wool toga. He refused the emperor's offer of a palace suite. He stayed in his childhood bedroom. This is neurologically extraordinary. Power is, in clinical terms, a dopaminergic flood event. It systematically degrades prefrontal regulation. The more power an individual acquires, the more the DLPFC's inhibitory control over limbic reward seeking is compromised. Marcus Aurelius ran the protocol in reverse. The hardening produced by early loss had calibrated his threat response system to treat excess stimulation as noise, as data to be filtered rather than consumed. What other men experienced as reward, his circuitry tagged as interference. The crucible was not circumstance, it was construction. And the construction was already complete before he ever held power. 166 AD. The Marcomanic Wars begin. Scanning the synaptic density of Marcus Aurelius in this specific operational theater, the forensic data reaches maximum resolution. 17 years of simultaneous military campaigns on the Danube frontier, managing 2 active war theaters while administering an empire still hemorrhaging population from the Antonine Plague. No modern head of state operates under this concurrent cognitive load. No modern executive processing model has been stress-tested at this resolution. And yet, the signal-to-noise ratio in this specific moment was operating at its most refined. Meditations books 2 through 4 were written during military campaigns, on the frontier, in a command tent, after battlefield decisions involving the lives of thousands. The content of those entries is not strategic. It is deeply philosophical, concerned with impermanence, attention, the proper relationship between the self and circumstance. This is the forensic signature of elite neural processing under maximum load. In flow state neurodynamics, the defining characteristic is transient hypofrontality, a temporary reduction in self-referential processing that allows pattern recognition systems to operate at higher speed with lower metabolic cost. The individual stops monitoring their own performance and simply processes at peak throughput. Marcus Aurelius had architected a protocol that induced this state deliberately. The nightly writing practice, the ACC activation, the DLPFC encoding, was essentially a system reset. It cleared the accumulated cognitive tax of the day's decision load, emptied the working memory buffer, and allowed the architecture to re-enter the following day's operational demands at full processing capacity. Modern high-performance research calls this cognitive offloading. Marcus called it evening reflection. The nomenclature is different. The neural mechanism is identical. His greatest tactical decision of the wars, the strategic decision to fortify and hold rather than pursue, preserving military capital over short-term territorial gains, was not acclaimed at the time. The Senate wanted aggression. The legions wanted glory. Marcus processed the long-range data and filtered the immediate political noise. That decision saved the empire. The circuitry that made it possible had been under construction since age 3. The system was not invulnerable. Let the forensic record be precise on this point. Marcus Aurelius was not superhuman. He was a high-performance architecture operating under conditions of sustained, compounding cognitive tax. And the tax accumulated. The 3 primary load vectors: power, grief, betrayal. Power, as previously identified, is a dopaminergic disruptor. Sustained exposure to executive authority produces measurable changes in the prefrontal regulation circuitry, a gradual erosion of the inhibitory systems that maintain signal clarity. In clinical populations, this manifests as increased impulsivity, reduced empathy processing, and accelerated threat response reactivity. Marcus Aurelius managed this load through deliberate signal attenuation. The philosophical practice was not decorative, it was a daily dopaminergic reset. a protocol for draining the accumulated reward signal distortion before it degraded the DLPFC's regulatory capacity. Grief delivered a different tax vector. Faustina, his wife, bore him 14 children. 9 did not survive to adulthood. 9. Each loss represents a cortisol event, a sustained activation of the HPA axis that, without managed processing, degrades hippocampal architecture and accelerates threat sensitization across the entire limbic system. Traditional biography calls his grief noble endurance. The forensic lens identifies a man performing active neural maintenance against a catastrophic emotional load, and largely succeeding. Then there was Avidius Cassius, 165 AD, his most trusted general, a man Marcus had publicly praised, promoted, and positioned as a potential successor, declared himself emperor, and launched a civil war. Historians call this betrayal. Forensic analysis identifies it as the single greatest threat to his neural architecture's integrity, because betrayal, neurologically, is not an emotional event. It is a fundamental revision of the pattern recognition model. Every inference Marcus had made about this individual was corrupted data. Every strategic decision that relied on those inferences now required complete reprocessing. This is not heartbreak. This is a system audit under maximum load. His response? He dispatched a message to Cassius offering full clemency and requesting peaceful resolution. Before the military response could even reach Syria, Cassius was assassinated by his own officers. Marcus was reported to be disappointed that he could not demonstrate the clemency publicly. Deconstruct the divine inspiration from this response, and what remains is advanced pattern recognition operating at full signal fidelity. He identified that a public execution would corrupt the political signal, would reframe his authority as punitive rather than stabilizing. He processed the long-range consequence data and filtered the immediate emotional reactivity. The system did not crash, it recalibrated, and the capacity to recalibrate under that load is the single most forensically significant data point in the entire Marcus Aurelius case file. Now the transfer, because everything previously analyzed is only operationally valuable if the architecture is accessible to you. And here is the fundamental data point that the traditional historical model buries under layers of biographical mythology. The hardware is identical. Your DLPFC operates on the same foundational circuitry as Marcus Aurelius. Your ACC runs the same conflict detection algorithms. The synaptic mapping that produced 2 decades of elite performance under maximum cognitive load is not a relic of a different biological era. It is a dormant protocol, present, intact, and awaiting calibration. Neuroplasticity is not a metaphor. It is a documented biological mechanism. The architecture changes in response to repeated activation patterns. Every time you engage your prefrontal circuitry in deliberate cognitive processing, journaling, structured reflection, voluntary exposure to complex ethical questions, you are running a version of the Marcus Aurelius protocol. You are performing the same synaptic maintenance he conducted in a command tent on the Danube frontier. The instrument is not exotic. The consistency is. Marcus Aurelius did not write in meditations because he had answers. He wrote because the act of writing generated signal clarity. The practice was the protocol. The protocol was the architecture. And the architecture was the performance. 3 entry points for immediate implementation. First, cognitive offloading. End each operational day with 5 minutes of written processing. Not journaling as self-expression. Forensic documentation of the day's highest load decisions and your evaluative response to each. This is ACC activation and DLPFC encoding running simultaneously. Second, signal attenuation. Identify your 3 highest volume noise sources, the inputs that generate the most emotional reactivity with the least strategic return, and implement deliberate exposure reduction. This is not avoidance. This is bandwidth management. Third, adversity indexing. Stop categorizing difficult experiences as interruptions to performance. Begin cataloging them as calibration events. Every high-load circumstance that you process without behavioral collapse is an epigenetic signature, a measurable increase in your system's stress response threshold. The ancient biohack that produced elite psychology in the most cognitively taxed leader in Western historical record was not sophisticated. It was consistent, performed daily, under maximum load, without exception and without self-congratulation. Marcus Aurelius wrote in Meditations, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one." Forensic translation, stop modeling the output. Activate the protocol. The hardware is identical. The protocol is dormant. The question for the comments and for your own neural architecture is this: what is your current signal-to-noise ratio, and at what cognitive load threshold does your prefrontal regulation begin to fail? Identify that threshold, because that number is not your limit. It is your starting point. End of neural autopsy. Marcus Aurelius case file. Protocol status, transferable. Hardware status, identical. Activation, your variable.